Hello and happy holidays. This is Steve and Dave's year-end wrap-up of our 50 years ago this month. So this time around, we're going to be talking about the year of 1972, the year in music, and events that were going on in the general world. So we'll just start right off with January. Steve?
Yeah, let's start with January 6th, if we could. On January 6th, President Nixon authorized the space shuttle program. And this was I think, a necessary thing for NASA, who was running into real problems with Congress in terms of funding. And so I think it's pretty clear, right, that NASA's high water mark was the summer of '69 with the moon landing. It was, one of the great achievements in human history. But in the years,
don't you find it funny that just less than 2.5 years later, right?
Yes,
and they're already saying, well, what have you done recently?
That's
what have you
that's exactly right. Yeah, there was they were both Congress and the American public to some degree were bored with moon landings. I mean, the Apollo set of missions continued on, right? We're still sending people to the moon, but it's like humdrum. And so what was the next step? And so the next step was to see space in a way that was maybe a bit more productive. And so it was the notion that you would have this basically this ferry, right? And that's how the space shuttle was described, as a ferry that was essentially reusable. And then if you would send astronauts to most likely a space station where they would do, their work, and space would become a very productive place. I think also embedded in this idea was the notion that this would be a way for ordinary citizens to make their way to space, because how different would a space shuttle be from what we had seen, for example, in 2001? The idea of sending people into space in a relatively kind of mundane way. I mean, this is where we were at. I think, as we recognize, the space shuttle program was fraught with difficulties. Even with the design itself, I think it was always the case that NASA engineers, they really struggled with the notion of the heat shields. We're all aware of the two catastrophic accidents involving the shuttle. The shuttle program was plagued with delays and budget overruns, and never really achieved the promise, I think, that was presented to the American public in January of '72. Nevertheless, it was the next step. It was the next step, and so you have that in early '72. On the music side, if I could, on the music side, I think one of the things that really stands out is the album from Paul Simon, not the debut album, it's the second album, the Paul Simon self-titled LP on Columbia.
It's kind of his debut album.
It is kind of his debut album. Briefly, you want to tell the story of his debut album, Dave, the Paul Simon Songbook.
Well, for a while there, Paul Simon was in England, living with his girlfriend, kind of trying to get some sort of foothold in the music business.
That's right.
Thought he had some chances over there, and he came up with a solo album of some material that was then released in 1965, before Simon and Garfunkel just got their start, and
that's right,
just went wild. But that never enjoyed any particular commercial success, and this was really his first solo album. This was the album, the Declaration of Independence.
That's exactly it. Yes,
from Art Garfunkel.
Art Garfunkel. Yeah. So this comes a couple of years after the split of Simon and Garfunkel. I think there was some doubt that these artists could survive on their own. I think that Garfunkel's solo career sort of bears that out. He really needed Simon, but Simon could flourish without Garfunkel, and this album, I think, is evidence of it. I mean, this is considered one of the best albums of the 1970s. It's in most lists of some of the greatest albums of all time. A couple of singles, of course, that jump off this album: the Mother and Child Reunion, and of course, Me and Julio Down by the Schoolyard. But it really is a kind of launching point for Simon's solo career, which is enormous in the 1970s. I think we lose sight of this a little bit, that it was a chart phenomenon. in the early and mid 70s. And the Paul Simon LP really makes that happen.
Well, it really shows that he was here to stay, with or without Art Garfunkel. And I think at this point, when he started working on the solo album, it wasn't even entirely clear that they weren't going to come back together.
That's right.
But I think by the end, it was just, clear that this was the beginning of a solo career, and that's where he was going.
I think you're right. And just real quick, one thing about that, the success of this album, and it was a very successful album, I think really was the nail in the coffin for Simon and Garfunkel, because it was clear that Simon could flourish and was, had a tremendous run in the 70s for sure. So what else was going down?
Well, let me just say a little bit about that.
Yeah.
Paul Simon's album was released on the 24th. Also released on the 24th was Cass Elliott's fourth solo album.
Yes, right.
Eponymous, Cass Elliot, her first for RCA. Michael Jackson's first solo album was released, Got to Be There. And Aretha Franklin's 18th studio album, Young, Gifted in Black, was also released on the 24th. So the 24th of January was a big day for music.
That it was. Absolutely. And that Aretha Franklin, when you talk about the pace of releases in this era, I mean, she's churning out an album, well, maybe every 9 months or something like that at some point. It's really quite astounding. But yeah, January 72 is big. Anything else happening in January 72?
Other albums that were released, not on that date, but we also had Bread's fourth studio album, Baby I'm a Want You.
Oh, Bread.
Yes. Jackson Browne's debut, called Jackson Browne.
Really interesting. If we could, about that. He was an enormous get for David Geffen, and the album was highly anticipated. And while he doesn't get tremendous traction on the singles chart until a little bit later, I mean, it really is kind of a landmark album, and it just speaks to the depth of the singer-songwriter of this era. I mean, it's just a continuous line of figures. But yeah, Jackson Browne was, it was a big deal.
And we also had the 14th album of the Temptations, Solid Rock. So
yeah, the Temps. So who didn't who held tight to those Detroit roots, the Temps, who remained, I think, an important act for Motown.
Yes.
And remarkably productive.
This was, of course, Norman Whitfield's Temptations, psychedelic soul.
Oh,
that sort of thing, right?
Yeah, it's terrific. I love this era of the Temps. It's fantastic.
Okay. We would be remiss to mention January 30th, 1972, Black Sunday, right?
Yeah.
Bloody Sunday. I'm getting this mixed up with the different tragedies of the year. Bloody Sunday, of course, one of the peak moments, I guess, of the Troubles in Ireland.
That's exactly right. It's the darkest day, probably. It's if you think about it, in 1972, the Troubles seemed intractable. It just seemed like they would be with us forever. One of the amazing things that's happened over the past half century is that, to a major degree, a lot of the sectarian violence in Northern Ireland has been sorted out. And we should give Tony Blair some credit for that. I mean, Tony Blair gets a lot of stick for his participation in the Middle East during the wars in Iraq. But he really was instrumental in guiding the peace process. And so, it's terrible. I mean, to look back at 72, it was British troops in the streets. It was a war zone. It was a war zone. I mean, Belfast was, yeah. I mean, Belfast was. It didn't look that different from Vietnam in some ways.
Yeah, and of course, in the middle of all that, people just trying to live their lives, right?
That's right. Exactly. So let's advance into February. What's happening in February of note?
Okay, in February, on the global stage, of course, one of the really big things that happened is that Richard Nixon, as the first U.S. president, visits the People's Republic of China, Red China. And it's so, I guess in some sense, it's kind of ironic that it's Nixon who's doing this, but in some ways, maybe he was the only guy that could have done it. A very vocal, very adamant anti-communist from his early career on, and yet he's the one reaching the palm stem out to the Chinese, the Mao Zedong.
Yeah, you're right. This is it does seem ironic on because Nixon did make his bones as an anti-communist. He was an anti-communist in the 1950s. But it's also the case, right, that he was looking to really to stretch his wings and to seem sort of as beyond credible. I think he was wanting to be perceived as a kind of international expert, alongside, of course, his partner in crime, Henry Kissinger. And so, again, this trip to China was months in the making, and much of it was in secret. Including kept in secret from his Secretary of State. But it's a big moment.
Well, and some of it was just also purely a matter of luck, of circumstances,
True.
Fortunate.
That's very true.
Because it was preceded by ping pong diplomacy.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. The whole thawing of relations started on the ping pong table. Just was that 72 or was it already back in 71?
I think that may have been in 71, but the ping pong diplomacy thing was a kind of just it was almost a lark, right? That it wasn't signed off by anybody at any kind of level. It was just sort of like, oh, let's go do this, and I got the invitation.
Yes. It was just a spontaneous and very human type of interaction, and it opened up a really huge real diplomacy going on then now in February 1972.
That's exactly right. It's China today, obviously in the 21st century, is an international player at almost every level, right? It's considered a real superpower, if you will. But in the 1970s, China was still a kind of hermit kingdom. It was a very impoverished country, and quite frankly, a kind of mysterious country that there really was closed to outsiders. You had a cadre of diplomatic personnel who would experience China, but beyond that, China was kind of closed. And so much of Nixon's visit was just sort of like, what is China really like? And I remember, and we'll put this in the playlist, but the coverage on this was wall to wall. I mean, for example, they had the dinner, the ceremonial dinner, the state dinner, that was broadcast live on CBS. And people were very interested in what the Chinese ate, for example, and what the Chinese wore, for example, and what the Chinese drove, for example. Just a lot of mystery about the country.
Yeah. Okay. So there was that. I mean, obviously a very significant thing, and that opened up Sino-American relations
100%.
going forward.
That's right.
I believe every president since Nixon has made that visit.
I believe that's right. Yeah.
So
I believe that's right. Yeah.
So he started that off, and that's a huge accomplishment. Is a part of what could have been a great legacy for.
That's right. I mean, the great, he wounded himself over and over again. But Nixon was very interested in linkages between a man perceived as this great peacemaker and also this man who's this kind of great international thinker and doer. And he was on his way in 72. There's no question about that.
The SALT talks also happened this year.
That's right.
Dayton, very big stuff. But okay, again, it was overshadowed by other things that were going on.
Yes, it was. It certainly was.
So, following that, February, right on the 1st of February, a huge event in the world of music. Neil Young releases Harvest. It was, I think, undisputably his landmark album.
Yeah.
It was the best-selling album of the year in 1972. It was Young's all-time bestseller.
Yes.
And the success of that album just kind of caught Neil Young off guard.
I think that's fair.
His first instinct was to back away from stardom. He would later write that the record, quote, put me in the middle of the road. Traveling there soon became a bore, so I headed for the ditch. A rougher ride, but I saw more interesting people there, end quote. And that seems to be a quintessential Young approach, feeling, whatever you want to say, attitude, right?
That's it. That's Neil Young. Neil Young does what Neil Young wants to do. And so I think Harvest caught everyone by surprise to a degree. And he quickly scuttled the notion that Neil Young was going to be a pop star. He wasn't going to have any of that. And so he went a completely different direction. But I think it's fair to say that many people hold Harvest in high regard. And again, not only the best selling album from Neil Young, but many people think of it as his apex. I know that you don't see it that way.
Yeah, okay.
But
I'm not a great country folk Young fan. I'm more of the rock Young guy. But yeah, clearly it's a quality album, and it's maybe worth mentioning that most of these songs were written for or inspired by Young's romantic partner at the time, Carrie Snodgrass, an actress of considerable talent, actually.
That's right. That's right.
Didn't have a huge career. There were a number of things that came between her and her career, but she became his wife, the mother of his first son, and were you aware that she was actually the first choice for Adrian?
No, I wasn't. I wasn't. I guess that eventually went to Talia Shire, but she would have been terrific. I mean, Snodgrass was, if you would have looked at actresses in the early 1970s and sort of projected what their careers would, I mean, people would have put a lot of money down on Snodgrass.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Fantastic in Diary of a Mad Housewife, and it looked as though the sky was the limit, but that really wasn't. That's not really how it turned out for her.
No. Yeah, her story is sad in a number of ways, but okay, maybe we'll talk about that later at some point. Let's see. Also in February, Wilt Chamberlain scored a record-setting 30,000 career points. That happened on February 16th in a game where he only scored 10 points, but that put him over the top. An incredible career. Back to music. Todd Rundgren's third album was released. It's a double album. 3 of the 4 sides were produced in the studio, and the 4th was a mix of live studio takes and archival material. That was Something Anything.
Yeah, Something Anything ? Again, people hold this record in tremendous regard. A lot of people think this is, again, Rundgren's magnum opus. It has a little bit of everything. Rundgren is the great chameleon, and so there isn't. So the album is folk. It's It's pop. It rocks. There's just a lot on it. It yielded a couple of singles of note. Hello and it's me being, I guess, the main one. But Something Anything is yeah, it's a milestone in Rundgren's career.
You know, that 70s show, I don't know if it was the first episode or the second, one of the very first episodes, they go to a Todd Rundgren concert. And there are a number of interesting things that happen there. But on the way back, they're all singing Hello, It's Me together.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. February 9th, Wings makes its first public appearance at a concert at the University of Nottingham. It's McCartney's first public concert since, well, if you don't count the rooftop of the Apple building, it was his first public concert since 1966 in the US.
I think that concert at Nottingham at the university happens in like the cafeteria. And if I'm not mistaken, I think it happens over the lunch hour or something like that. It couldn't have been more low key, which is exactly what McCartney was looking for.
Yeah.
He really was trying to sort of, as you're suggesting, I think, sort of ease back in it. And yeah, it's hard to imagine, Paul McCartney playing like a cafeteria post Beatles, but there it was. It happened just that way.
Yeah, he wasn't playing cafeterias very long after
That's true. That's true.
A day later, David Bowie opened his Ziggy Stardust tour at the Toby Jug pub in Tolworth, Surrey.
You have a couple thoughts. The Ziggy Stardust era for Bowie was I think many ways it's probably his most memorable era. I think it was highly influential. I think for some people it was a bit off-putting, but you have thoughts about the Ziggy Stardust? I mean, that was the Spiders from Mars, Mick Ronson, the whole that.
Right. I think clearly his most productive, creative period. I mean, he was just a couple months later. He'd write All the Young Dudes from Off the Hoople and just give that away. And the Ziggy Stardust persona was his attempt to embody the rock star messiah.
Yes. Yeah.
It was really messianic, and love or hate Ziggy Stardust, but it was a fascinating character, a fascinating figure.
It was,
and the music was fantastic.
Well, that's what exactly. So it would have meant very little without the music, and then the Spiders from Mars, the band is just, I mean, it's just stellar. It's I guess maybe this is obviously a different time. I mean, I think it's impossible to imagine somebody trying to pull that off today, but it was taken very seriously. It was deeply embraced by Bowie's fans, and when the Ziggy Stardust disappeared, basically it ended very quickly. Many of his fans were just heartbroken. So a big moment for Bowie for sure.
Well, and probably more than any other single artist, David Bowie defined glam rock, right?
Oh, absolutely.
You know, you have
question.
T-Rex, you have other people out there. Elton John's going to go glam and things like that, sweet. But I think that the single biggest influence on the whole glam rock movement was David Bowie.
That's
and
right.
Ziggy Stardust was that influence, I think.
Yeah, that's right.
So on the 12th, Eat a Peach was released.
Oh, yeah.
By the Allman Brothers Band. It was a mixed live studio album, a double album. So a big album for them.
For sure. No bigger. Well, I mean, apart from maybe Leonard Skinner, I mean, it's one of the most star-crossed bands ever. I mean, they lose two members, but those Allman Brothers albums from the early 70s on Capricorn are they're extraordinary. They really are.
A day later, Led Zeppelin's concert in Singapore is canceled because the authorities there don't let them get off the plane because of their long hair.
Yes. Singapore, then and now, a pretty tightly wound country. And so the Singaporean government, right, famous for trying to regulate almost everything within society. It's kind of shocking to think that somebody actually booked Led Zeppelin. So I actually thought that this concert would actually go off. Who are they kidding?
Yeah. And it didn't. So
That's right.
whoever was miscalculated badly.
100% there. Yeah.
On the week of the 14th, Lennon and Yoko Ono would co-host the Michael Douglas show.
Yeah.
That show going for maybe a shift toward a younger audience, toward a younger demographic, so this was definitely the way to go for that.
Really interesting set of shows. So they host the show for a week. Shout out to Mike Douglas, by the way. His show was filmed in Philadelphia and tended to be, so it was syndicated, so it tended to be broadcast across the United States in the afternoons. And so Douglas in this era had a lot of really interesting guests, and you know who's more interesting than John and Yoko. And the thing about it was that kids saw it, so that unlike the Tonight Show or even the Cavett Show, which broadcast late at night, young kids could watch this thing in the afternoons. And I remember it's quite distinctly that I was a big Mike Douglas fan because there are all sorts of rock acts on it, and the week of shows, right, are quite famous. I mean, you have a whole host of a whole slew of guests from a wide variety across the political spectrum, and famously, right, they invite Chuck Berry to play, and so Lennon and his idol Chuck Berry jam through a couple of numbers. It's really a great series of shows.
Okay, on the 18th, Manfred Mann's Earth Band put out their self-titled debut.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. On the 15th, the United States, for the first time, gives federal copyright protection to sound recordings. Up until then, it's only been on the state level. This is the first time that sound recordings actually had federal copyright protection. February 15th, 1972.
No small thing. No small thing. Yeah, no small thing at all. Yeah, and it gives, I think, real credence to the importance in this era of sound recordings. It's still, I mean, the recorded music was paramount in the culture in the early 1970s, and some evidence of that.
On the 19th, Paul McCartney's single "Give Ireland Back to the Irish," which was inspired by Bloody Sunday Massacre, was banned by the BBC.
Well, that's what they did. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
that was their move, wasn't it?
Sure. And nothing can help a recording more than being banned. So exactly. that ended up putting the single in the top 20 in England. So thank you very much, BBC.
Thank you very much. And again, real quickly, it's McCartney at his most political. I mean, unlike Lennon, McCartney was famously apolitical, but this song was pretty explicit, and it's pretty rare, pretty unusual for McCartney in this era and the era. It's just didn't record or write very many political songs.
Okay. Same day on the 19th, Sammy Davis Jr. made a guest appearance on All in the Family.
Yeah.
Yes, with the main character, of course, being Archie Bunker, who was not known for being a racially tolerant individual. Steve, what do you think the most famous moment from that show was?
Well, my sense is probably the most famous moment is how the episode ends when Archie wants a picture.
Yeah, because Archie's a big fan of
Archie's a big
Jr., right?
He's a big fan, but yet he's not necessarily a big fan of having a black man in his home. And so, yeah, but he wants the picture. And so as the picture is getting snapped, then Sammy Davis Jr. lays a big old smacker on Archie's cheek, the big kiss. And really one of the moments of the 70s that's really quite, it's really quite astounding. It's a great episode.
Okay, on the 23rd, Elvis and Priscilla Presley separate. On the 29th, John Lennon's U.S. visa expires. So that starts a 3.5 year fight to remain in the country because, of course, the Nixon administration,
of course,
his visa expires, then he has to leave. We're going to deport him because we're not going to extend a visa for this guy, the guy that sings "Let's Give Peace a Chance" and Imagine.
That's right.
That's not really the sort of person we want here.
No, that's right. And so the Nixon administration makes a strategic decision to play to their base and make Lennon's life hell. And I mean, it's just red meat. It's red meat to the silent majority.
Silent majority.
But it is also the case that Lennon's immigration status becomes a kind of cause celeb, and people were very exercised by this. And you had a lot of support for Lennon, a lot of public support for Lennon. Okay, obviously he was a Beatle. That was part of it. But also I think people, even ordinary Americans, believed that he was being dealt with unfairly. I mean, there's something about this that he was being singled out, and I think most people could smell that a mile away.
All right. Just to finish out, other albums released in February, Cherish, David Cassidy's debut album. Then we had Gordon Lightfoot's 8th album, Don Quixote, and Lonesome Crow, debut album of another group, a German band.
Well, I think it's those rockers, the Scorpions.
The Scorpions. That's their first album on February 1972.
Scorpions will be they'll be a big act in heavy metal. I mean, they're still with us, but I mean they were really influential in the 70s and 80s for sure.
Well, the most successful international German band by a mile, you know.
And that's something. Yeah, that's by a mile. And I think people would maybe think it was Kraftwerk or something, you know. But no, it's the Scorpions.
Oh yeah. So
record sales, yeah.
Well, and now we have oh geez, also very, very hard metal. Who am I thinking of?
I don't know. Maybe one of our viewers can pitch in. I'm not sure. A hard rocking German band of the 21st century.
Yes. Named after a air show disaster in Germany.
Oh my God. I'm sorry. I'm not going to be able to help you with this.
Rammstein.
Rammstein.
Yes. Rammstein.
But rock on.
But they're a German language band, right? And that's why they're never going to have the sort of international success that the Scorpions did.
Yeah, the Scorpions made the decision early on, right, to sing in English, and it's
if you want to be successful on the international stage, that's what you've got to do, right? And
that's for sure.
Rammstein, for instance, has an international following.
Right,
but not the sort that's going to. It's a cult following, right? It's not the sort that's going to put them on the charts. So,
I mean, yes, exactly right.
Last but not least, the 9th studio album by Canadian rockers, the Guess Who, Rockin.
Now, I think you can correct me. Has Bachman left by this time?
Yes, he has.
Yeah, so the band takes a very different turn once Bachman leaves. I mean, but Bachman, of course, then starts Bachman Turner Overdrive. But the Guess Who continued to churn out hits in the early into mid 70s, but it's not quite the same band without Randy Bachman for sure.
Yeah. So that was February.
All right. So let's think about March a little bit, and a couple of notes from March. One, from the headlines in March, and so it's March 22nd, and from the Supreme Court, a ruling in Eisenstadt v. Bard about birth control. Bill Bard was a contraception advocate and had been for years. And he was operating in Massachusetts. Massachusetts, a conservative Catholic state in matters dealing with reproduction, had a law in the books for a long time barring access to contraception to single citizens of Massachusetts. Now, what's odd about all of this, of course, is that the oral contraceptives for women were on the market as early as the early 1960s. They've been on the market for a decade. Now, it was the case that they were prescription, and many doctors would not fill a prescription or sign a prescription for a single woman. So women across the United States were having to pretend that they were married. That was one of the complications of all this. But women in Massachusetts were really having trouble. And so at a student gathering in 1967, Baird handed a package of condoms and a package of oral contraceptives to a student, and he was immediately arrested. The case wound its way through the courts, and eventually then the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Baird and noted that under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, you couldn't bar single Americans from contraception. It was considered a landmark ruling of the day. It was very much in keeping with the Supreme Court's general tenor in the early 70s in terms of reproductive rights. And all of that, of course, has changed in recent months in the United States. But this definitely seemed a kind of a ruling that was, kind of sign of the times. And so Eisenstadt v. Baird was a big deal in March of 1972.
The general tenor now, the signs of the times,
well,
look like that. It would not be surprising to see that reversed in the next year or two.
That I would agree with you completely. And it's interesting. The general tenor of the times, I think, is really, in terms of reproductive rights, I think the public is very much in favor of reproductive rights. It's that conservative Americans in the courts have, they've changed their tune dramatically.
Well,
and certainly the Supreme Court
is not necessarily in tune with the general attitudes about.
And that's yes, I think that's, I mean, the polling bears that out. It's certainly my sense as well. It's fascinating that so much of this in the United States happened so rapidly in terms of court rulings. I think for many people, it happened maybe too rapidly, and it's fascinating that conservative groups used a ruling like this, for example, as kind of fuel to rethink their strategy in terms of the courts, in terms of how the courts would be filled. I think in particular, the Republican Party took this, and they played the long game, right? Over the span literally of a half a century, the federal courts were populated with judges who were less likely to rule in regard to reproductive rights in liberal sort of fashion. And there we are today. It's fascinating.
Well, that was and that was a campaign hot button for them for decades. And
for decades, yeah.
I mean, they have successfully gotten a number of candidates elected on a single issue in some areas. Arguably, Donald Trump became president because of his.
I think that's right.
It's support.
It's one of the things that makes the 70s, I think, so fascinating, and it's such an important era, is that it really it really kind of set an agenda for certainly a segment of Americans who were willing then to be disciplined and kind of follow this agenda as long as it took. And that has borne fruit for the Heritage Foundation, for conservative Republicans in particular, right, in the 21st century. I mean, it is remarkable, the discipline that was exercised by these people. They got what they wanted in the end. They really did. Shifting gears though to music, if we could for a second. One of the more interesting albums of the 70s was released on March 3rd, and that album is Jethro Tull's Thick as a Brick. This is a fascinating group, and Tull is at the height of their powers in this era. The musicality of this group is, I mean, it's almost unmatched. They're so versatile. They're so ambitious. They're so daring. And this album is sort of part of that. It is it's a kind of parody of the concept LP, which was becoming all the rage in the early 1970s. But that being said, it became a kind of concept album based around this incredible, child genius. And because it's the 70s, and it is sort of the era of excess, the LP was packaged with a 12-page newspaper where you could read the stories about this young lad and all this kind of thing. And so it's exactly but it's in terms of the music, I mean, again, this is the 70s, and so this is basically kind of one number, 43-minute long kind of song. Now, Thick as a Brick, the single, was sort of extracted from this, but it really speaks to Tull's ambition. Many people see this as one of the best albums of the 1970s. It actually hits #1 on the US LP chart. If you think about that for a second, an album that is essentially sort of one long song broken up by 2 album sides is the best-selling album in the US. I mean, that speaks to a number of things in the 1970s. I mean, it's just the variety of music that was popular and that could be popular in this era. I mean, I think consumers were maybe a bit more open to buying something that would sort of push them in a way. And I think it's fair to say that Thick of a Brick does ask something of the listener. But Tull is at the height of their powers here. It's really quite an album, and it's really quite a band. And let's hope that they finally make the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame this year.
It would certainly be,
decades overdue.
It's overdue, yeah.
So what else is going down in March?
Well, what's going on in March 3rd musically? Jethro Tull releases Thick as a Brick, yes. But Black Magic is also released. That's the 10th and last soul album by Martha Reeves and the Vandellas, released on the Gordy label from Motown. Reeves says that a lot of that material was originally intended for Diana Ross.
Of course it was. Yeah.
Anyway, so they recorded that, but that was their swan song. And Music of My Mind, the 14th studio album by Stevie Wonder, was also released on that day by Tamla Records, also a Motown label.
Yes. This is such an important album for him.
It was the first one to be recorded under Wonder's new contract with Motown that allowed him full artistic control over his music. And he went on to be a juggernaut in the 70s.
That's for sure.
And certainly one of the acts that kept Motown above water in that time. Grammy after Grammy, it's just incredible. And this was basically the start of that. So another big day for music, March 3rd, 1972.
Does that take us to April?
Well, we have a couple other things going on.
All right.
On March 11th, Harry Chapin's debut album came out, Heads and Tails.
Yeah, real quickly about Chapin. Obviously, Chapin, a kind of beloved figure, died a young man, 1981. A great advocate for a number of issues, including hunger. Chapin was first a filmmaker in New York City, and a filmmaker of some note. He actually won an Oscar
Wow.
for
Okay. I
for
did
one
not
of
know
his
that.
short documentaries. He was, but he was a storyteller at heart, and he made this transition to music again in the early 1970s. But he was already, in his own way, a fairly well established artist in another medium before he's released this album.
Okay. Well, of course, the single "Taxi" came from that album, and was initial
Yeah,
spark for a modestly successful career.
modestly successful career, but yeah, but people, his fans, they loved him.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
On the 15th, the LA disc jockey Robert W. Morgan played Donny Osmond's "Puppy Love" nonstop for 90 minutes. The police were called, but no arrests were made.
Well, that was a crime. I I don't know. I mean, I'm
Well,
not quite sure why
he
they.
got off early, or easy rather. Machine Head by Deep Purple was released on the 25th, and that recounted. Sorry, the Smoke on the Water. I think their biggest single.
Oh, I think yes, right.
Recounted the recording of that album. Right, we all went down to Montreux, making records in a mobile. Right. So, and then
Some stupid with a flare gun burn the place
to the ground. Right. So, it's a fascinating story, and it's a great song. But it's about Machine Head, about the recording of this album. 2 days later, Three Dog Night comes out with their 8th studio album, Seven Separate Fools. It reached number 6 on the U.S. Billboard 200, became the band's highest charting album, which is saying something if we're talking Three Dog Night.
That's right.
Brian Wilson placed that LP at number 3 among his all-time top 10 favorite records. So I think I'm somebody who says, well, if Brian Wilson has an opinion about music, I'm going to certainly listen to it.
I agree completely. If anything, I think it's time for a critical reappraisal of Three Dog Night on some level, right? And they've for half a century they've been a punching bag by critics, but their choice.
We always loved them, right?
Yeah, and we learned from them. And the interesting thing about Three Dog Night was not that they cherry picked these great songs from these great writers that oftentimes we hadn't heard of. And so suddenly we knew about Harry Nilsson. Suddenly we knew about Laura Nyro. Suddenly we knew about Randy Newman. They take an obscure civil rights song. Yes, exactly.
Like Black and White, and make that into a top 10 hit. And you're thinking, who would ever think this is going to be a rock single? But they had a nose for that.
They did. I agree completely. Yes, they did. They had a nose for it.
On the 31st, the official Beatles fan club closed down. So, thinking there's no more point. The boys they're gone.
That fan club obviously was millions participated. It was also the fan club that the Beatles themselves respected. And Beatles famously, right, would record these holiday albums or holiday singles that were then distributed exclusively to fan club members, a kind of Christmas card to them. And so the fan club was a big deal. I mean, it was really active, and I'm sure that its closing then was very much a kind of mark of an era.
Well, I think the Beatles really appreciated their fans. Maybe above all, Ringo Starr. He was well known for being very, very true to his fans and really appreciating them. And all right, just 3 other albums from March. We had Bare Trees, the 6th studio album from Fleetwood Mac. Was released.
One of the most interesting groups of all time.
Yeah, okay, I think that's fair to say. They had certainly a fascinating history.
Just almost from genre to genre as the different lineups.
And their first lead guitarist, right, Peter Green,
Mhm.
was the Beatles' Sun King. The song Sun King from Abbey Road was about him.
Yeah, I mean, yes, don't sleep on early Fleetwood Mac. It's very different from the Buckingham mix era, but it's really interesting in its own way.
Okay. Pure Prairie League came out with their self-titled debut. And
Country rock. Yeah.
and the fifth studio album from America's favorite family, the Partridge Family, was released in March 1970,
Oh,
just as the second season of the show was drawing to an end. It was called Shopping Bag. And, if you want to talk about gimmicks that are included with the albums, a 12-page newspaper is one thing, but they actually put a shopping bag, a little plastic shopping bag, in the album for their fans.
oh, yeah. Um, they were right. Their magical run was coming quickly to an end, but they they got everything out of it they could. By they meaning like ABC Dunhill and also ABC Television. I mean, somebody profited enormously from the Partridge Family. It wasn't necessarily the people, the actors or the singers, but there was a lot of money being made.
A lot of money being made, yeah. So there's that. That brings us to April. On April 2nd, John Lennon and Yoko Ono hold a press conference to discuss their appeal against the decision to deport John. As you said, this was an ongoing thing. This is right at the beginning of that, but this would go on for 3.5 years and would be followed closely by a lot of people.
That's right.
On the 10th, the Raspberries was released. That was their debut album, self-titled. Second highest charting LP, reached their second highest charting LP, reached number 51 on the Billboard album, but it spent more weeks on the chart than all their other albums combined. And
man,
that's with the hit Please Go All the Way, right?
Oh my God, yeah, that's right. So the Toast of Cleveland, right? So Eric Carmen led the Raspberries, power pop at its finest, right? So Go All the Way that thing is incendiary. It's just fantastic.
Man. Yeah, I remember we just loved every time that came on.
But that whole album is really good. It's a bit of a mystery actually why the Raspberries weren't more than they were. But yeah, that's a fine album and definitely worth a deep dive.
A day later, Mardi Gras comes out. That's the seventh and final studio album by CCR. This was recorded after the departure of guitarist Tom Fogerty. The band's only studio album as a trio. It featured songs written, sung, and produced by each of the remaining members, rather than just John Fogerty. Nevertheless, the recording sessions, or perhaps because of that, the recording sessions were marred by personal and creative tensions. It seems like that's true of the history of this band, but the group disbanded shortly after the album was made, and a short U.S. tour to support the album. CCR, Creedence Clearwater Revival, was no more.
It's Christgau, right? Robert Christgau, who says that this is the worst album made by the best band. It's a dreadful album. Aside from 2 songs, both penned by Fogerty. I mean, as you're suggesting, it was a democratic effort, which is why it was a disaster. I mean, it's just terrible.
On the 16th, the Electric Light Orchestra made their live debut at the Fox and Greyhound pub at Park Lane, Croydon, England.
It's the band that comes from the ashes of an English group called The Move.
Yes,
it's Bev Bevan, Roy Wood, and Jeff Lynne, who then sort of transformed themselves into the Electric Light Orchestra. The Beatles were big fans. The individual members of the Beatles were big fans of ELO, and with some suggestion that this might have been kind of a direction that the Beatles would have taken had they stayed together. They really were considered almost kind of avant-garde in a way, and their early albums are are heavily influenced by classical music. They become much more poppy as they get into the late 70s into the early 80s. But yeah, it was actually, I think, quite jarring for some people to see classical instruments, the viola, the cello, on stage, everybody rocking. But this was ELO in its earliest incarnation.
Well, it's like with Jethro Tull. You think, well, what instrument has rock music been missing up until now? And somebody says, "Oh, the sax." You go, "Oh, yeah, the sax, that could work." Somebody says the flute, and you go, no, I don't think so. And somebody says the cello or the violin, no, won't work.
Yeah.
But it definitely worked. Electric Light Orchestra was on fire throughout the 70s and early 80s.
Agreed. Totally agree.
March 28th, Argus, the third, sorry, this is April. April 28th, the third album by Wishbone Ash.
Wishbone Ash, yeah.
Was released.
Yeah, prog rock group. Many people think this is Wishbone Ash's high water mark. And Wishbone Ash they sold a lot of records in this era. They didn't have much chart success, in terms of the singles chart, but they sold a lot of albums in the United States and in Europe. Yeah.
Other albums released in April. Lou Reed's debut album, released two years after Reed left the Velvet Underground. Studio musicians involved were Yes's Rick Wakeman and Steve Howe.
That's such an odd pairing.
Well,
I mean, it's a gig, it's a job, I get it, but I mean, it's like those people don't seem like they even belong in the same room.
Well, apparently, these recording sessions were done in the dark. One of these two guys relates that little tidbit for whatever it's worth. So, the second album by April Wine came out on record.
Canadian group. Yeah.
Yes. Procol Harum Live in concert with the Edmonton Symphony Orchestra. That was recorded on November 18th, 1971. Wow. But the album reached number 7 in Canada, number 5 on the Billboard Top 200. It's the band's best-selling album. And the version of Conquistador that most people are familiar with came from this album. The studio version didn't get any mileage. I don't think it was even released as a single. So this is the Conquistador that everybody knows.
Yeah, including with the false start, which is fantastic. But it's quite an album. It's a kind of quasi greatest hits album, as you're suggesting. And it is the Procol Harum is one of those bands that a lot of people have heard of and know, but they actually had comparatively little sort of singles success in the United States. But really, another really interesting band from this era, no question.
A Thing Called Love, the 39th album by Johnny Cash, released on Columbia Records. The title song was written by Jerry Reed. Was also a successful single, reaching number 2 on the country charts. And the album itself also reached number 2 on the country album charts.
Yeah. Let us all praise Johnny Cash.
Johnny Cash, a wonderful man. Made a lot of great music, but he's just, what a guy, just fantastic.
I think that's the universal assessment. He was a solid man.
Last but not least, You Don't Mess Around with Jim. Jim Croce's studio album was released in April.
Yeah, it's again, Croce's life ends all too soon, and his recording career was very brief. But so many of these songs have kind of entered the American canon.
Yeah,
they're almost like folk songs. Almost like have been. I mean, it's almost hard to imagine a time when these Jim Croce songs weren't there. I mean, they just seem to sort of fit so perfectly into American popular music. But yeah, I guess it's really
such a great storyteller.
Exactly. Yes.
Fantastic, really.
You could have imagined Croce having a very long career, a distinguished and well into, his elder years, just, these songs just pouring out of him and all that.
Well, he could have been huge. Really.
Yeah, for sure.
He had the talent and was off to a very, very big start.
Yeah, no question. So does that take us to May then?
Takes us to May.
So May of 72. A couple things from the headlines. May 26th, Richard Nixon travels to Moscow, meets then Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev face-to-face, leader-to-leader diplomacy. They're there to ink the treaty for the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT I, a treaty, among other things, that froze the number of ballistic missiles that both sides could have. This is still the height of the Cold War, and gatherings between American and Soviet leaders were very rare. But this is also an era where Nixon is at his most ambitious, if not even audacious, internationally. 72 will be a very big year for Nixon in this regard. And so the travel to Moscow was, I think, part of a larger effort by Nixon to sort of position himself as this kind of great internationalist. I think Nixon always had an eye toward history. And I think Nixon, and I think with some justification, saw himself as a kind of international expert, a person who could get things done that other people couldn't. Helping him along the way is Henry Kissinger, who also thought of himself as one of the great internationalists. And both men had great high opinions of themselves, but thought comparatively little of each other. It's really quite astounding to read more about how much they disliked and distrusted each other. Nevertheless, they brought the SALT I treaty together. And
well, Kissinger was a Jew, wasn't he? Nixon.
Well, that was part of the antagonism from Nixon's perspective. Yeah, I mean, it was yes, and so Nixon was a closet,
at least a closet anti-Semite,
like at least a closet anti-Semite.
Yeah.
They also both were they hungered for affirmation. They hungered for the spotlight, and they both saw each other as kind of threats in that regard.
Well, don't you think Henry Kissinger was one of the few Secretary of States that had almost a star-like, I don't know if quality, but it was treated like a star.
Yeah, see, I think he certainly had that star-like quality. I think that there were previous very visible Secretaries of State. John Foster Dulles comes to mind, but you're right. I mean, Kissinger. I mean, he squired young women. Kissinger would show up at like Studio 54 and things like that.
Studio 54, for God's sake, yeah.
Yeah, and I think this drove Nixon to incredible distraction. The infighting in the White House was legendary, and it's also the case that this is still the era where Kissinger is not the Secretary of State, and so the Secretary of State is William Rogers is oftentimes frozen out of these conversations.
Oh, holy cow! I did not even realize that.
Yeah. So you can't make it up. It's just there's just so much infighting going on in the White House, and so it's
to Nixon's credit then that he recognizes the value of détente. I mean, Kissinger was the architect.
Yes,
and this is what makes these summit meetings possible and makes them profitable and leads to things like SALT agreements.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. And so there's plenty of, I mean, there are plenty of reasons not to really put your arms around Nixon.
Well,
but
or either one of them for that matter.
Or either one of them. Yeah. I mean, 100%. But it is the case that Nixon both Nixon and Kissinger were able to sort of envision things that I think other people had trouble envisioning. And they were able to put together things that other people really just weren't able to do. And so
people from their party, at least.
From their party. I mean, and so they really were, I mean, I don't want to overstate this, but they really were kind of visionary in this regard. I mean, the idea, you talked about it soon, but about China, but everything seemed possible, right? And so everything seemed possible for Nixon at this point. The war was winding down. He was in a race for re-election with against the Democratic Party. It was hopelessly overmatched at this point. Um, there, I mean, as we look at sort of the spring of '72, all things seem possible for Nixon. This great, this great kind of phoenix, kind of coming up from the ashes of political defeat and embarrassment, and of course, then he sort of throws it all away. But
well, yes, this is somebody who, without Watergate, would have had, I think, a fairly impressive legacy.
I dare say, like a kind of almost Mount Rushmore 2 legacy. I mean, if you think about Watergate stains everything.
Right.
And if you look closely at what happened in Southeast Asia, that's ugly.
That's also definite.
But there is a lot on the Nixon resume, both internationally and domestically. As we talked about before, previous episodes, the EPA, Title IX, all sorts of things happening domestically that are also quite important. Man, he just threw it all away.
Threw it all away.
Threw it away for no reason. His own paranoia. Musically, I want to just mention quickly a release from May 23rd of Randy Newman's "Sail Away" LP. "Sail Away" is an album that is held again in high regard by lots of music aficionados, and I think to some degree, Randy Newman was a kind of acquired taste for most. He certainly wasn't a pop star at this point. He would achieve a little bit of pop success at the end of this decade with a single called "Short People." I think today, though, in the 21st century, Randy Newman is best known for his soundtrack work with Pixar films, including the Toy Story series and "You've Got a Friend in Me" and all of that.
Yeah.
But the classic Newman is the acerbic Newman, and it doesn't get much more acerbic or darker, frankly, than "Sail Away." "Sail Away," the title track, for example, is the song of a slave trader extolling the virtues of the United States, this land of great opportunity, to his enslaved cargo on the ship. It's a really dark song. Also on this album is "Political Science," where a kind of a worn out American is sort of hears all the hue and cry about what America is doing and not doing internationally, and he basically exclaims, well, maybe we should just drop the big one and see what happens. There's a lot of things here that are, well, at the very least, thought-provoking. It's considered, again, one of the great albums of the 1970s. Newman is a kind of quintessential singer-songwriter. I think Newman, for many people, was a guy that Three Dog Night covered. But when you went into, Newman is the kind of person that if you went into someone's home and you saw Randy Newman albums on the shelf, that said something about the person. It was like, oh, yeah, music, because people who knew and loved music loved Randy Newman. And so "Sail Away" is certainly a part of that, and probably the high watermark of his career.
And it's so strange that because it was so dark, Brian Wilson credits that album. He said it profoundly affected him after its release, and it kept him from sliding further into madness and depression, which is strange considering what kind of album it was.
Yes, it is. Very strange. You got that right.
But he ranks "Sail Away" third on his list of 5 albums I can't live without. Okay.
Yeah, it's Brian Wilson. I'm with you. Yeah. So what else do we have happening in May?
Well, the Jeff Beck Group makes their last album, their third studio album, self-titled, Jeff Beck Group.
The mercurial Jeff Beck, right?
Yes.
It's hard to pin down on almost every level.
Roberta Flack and Donny Hathaway put out their first album as a duo, released on Atlantic, and there are few duos that have such a chemistry.
That's exactly right. No, well said. That's right.
And so they do a lot of work together, and this was the first album that they worked on together. That was on the 6th. On the 12th, "Exile on Main Street" comes out. The 12th album, American studio album by the Stones, released on Rolling Stones Records.
This is the Stones at their most debauched, and it's also the greatest. The Stones are a mess. Personally, there's a lot of things happening in the Stones camp that is deeply problematic. But this is also right in the middle of the Mick Taylor era, who replaces Brian Jones. And for my money, the Mick Taylor era is the best era, is the most compelling era of the Stones. And Exile on Main Street is, I think, it's right up there, right? In terms of the great Stones albums. It's
Sure, absolutely.
Either one or two. It's right there.
And this was, of course, recorded in France in a kind of tax exile.
Oh.
Very similar to Honky Chateau in that sense. So yeah, there was a kind of an exile actually.
Oh, and you talk about, yeah, and it's kind of dark too. The tales of those recording sessions, or failed recording sessions, or it's really, oh man, it's amazing that anyone lived through it. It's amazing that anyone survived that.
Yeah, and you look at the old rockers, the survivors, and you have someone like Keith Richards, who was lucky to survive the 70s.
Yes.
So
great. Yeah.
Just mentioned Honky Chateau. That was the 5th studio album by Elton John. That was released on the 19th, a week later. And it was titled after the 18th century French chateau where he was recording all this stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. This is his big breakout in the United States, and that's fair, right? It's Honky Chateau makes Elton John a kind of household name in the U.S.
It was the first album to reach #1 in the U.S. And the first of 7 consecutive #1 albums for Elton John, driven by the successful singles like Rocket Man and Honky Cat. So, yeah, this was a big deal.
Huge. Yeah.
Same day, the 19th, Demons and Wizards was released. Uriah Heep's 4th studio album, released by Browne Records in the UK and Mercury Records in the US. And on we have Come From Shadows, also released in April. The 13th studio album, 15th overall, by Joan Baez. It's her first album for A&M after recording for over a decade at Vanguard, an independent label.
Yeah.
A People Hold On, second album by a former Temptations vocalist, Eddie Kendricks, was released on the Tamla label of Motown. And we talked about psychedelic soul and Norman Whitfield.
Yeah.
Eddie Kendricks didn't really appreciate that direction, which is why he is a former Temptations vocalist and went solo. Anyway, this is his second album.
Yeah, and Kendricks will have some solo success in the 70s, but I don't think it ever quite approached what he had with the Temptations. But you're right. Yeah, with psychedelic, the Temps went all in on psychedelic soul, and not everybody was thrilled about it, and so that explains in part his exit.
Sailing Shoes, a second studio album by Little Feat, was released.
With the great Lowell George. Yeah, one of the
and a great cover.
Great cover. Again, considered one of the finest albums of the 1970s. It's a bit of I want to say kind of a lost band. They didn't have much singles chart success, but people who love music know Little Feat and know the work of Lowell George.
And we had Still Bill, the second studio album by Bill Withers. And this was recorded and produced with Withers by musicians from the Watts 103rd Street Rhythm Band.
There we go. Withers his story is, again, we've talked about in previous episodes, one of the most interesting, one of the most compelling ever. And he's hitting on all cylinders in the early 70s for sure.
Oh, last thing, April 27th, the Opryland USA Country Music Theme Park opens in Nashville, Tennessee.
Yeah, a word about that. So Opryland, opens on the edge of Nashville, which means then that the Grand Ole Opry moves from the legendary Ryman Auditorium to Opryland, where it still exists. In fact, the Grand Ole Opry has been now at Opryland longer than it was at the Ryman. But it does, I think, suggest a kind of transition happening in country music. Some people would say that it's a kind of inauthentic kind of trend, but it also, I think, speaks to the mass market appeal that country music is starting to tap into, and that Opryland, it really is, it's an amusement park, but it really was meant to provide a kind of entertainment experience for the masses. And I think many people would suggest that country music was losing something when the Opry moved out of the Ryman. So yeah, it was in its own way, I think, a pretty important symbolic move.
Takes us to May.
Takes us to June.
I'm sorry, it does take us to June after April.
So what's going on in June of '72?
Well, for one thing, we have a strange little news item, June 17th, about a break-in at the Watergate Hotel, the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee.
Yes, strange little news item. Emphasis on little and strange. It was seemed almost as inconsequential at the time, barely merited mention in the Post.
And the number of things about this made it less than inconsequential is just the strangeness of it.
Exactly.
It's just so odd, right? What there were like five burglars?
Yes, and so they're bringing recording equipment into the building.
That's just it. They're not burgling anything. They're not taking shit. They're bringing stuff. They're bringing stuff in.
I know that they were called the Plumbers Unit, initially created to track down leaks in the White House and all of that. It is, though, astounding that a guy like Gordon Liddy had any kind of credence. I mean, this is essentially sort of, Liddy's notion here. It's the greatest unforced error in American politics. It has to be. Bugging the DNC, a party that, couldn't tie their shoes at this point. They were not going to be a factor in the presidential race at all. Oh, unbelievable.
And of course, this was all part of a dirty tricks campaign.
Yes.
By the committee to reelect the president. What exactly this acronym is? It's the strangest. If you came up with this in fiction, your editor would tell you, yeah, okay, do something a little bit more realistically.
Because the acronym, because
the acronym is CREEP, creep.
Creep. I mean, you can't make it up. You're right. You would be told to go back to the drawing board.
Go back to the drawing board.
But this was business as usual in the Nixon White House.
Yeah,
as you're suggesting.
Dirty tricks, anything that works. And they were in charge of a number of things, a number of the things that were very successful. But in the end, as you say, completely superfluous.
Completely. I mean, even not as it turns out, it was pretty clear that this campaign, going through the primary process, that that George McGovern, George McGovern was not going to win the White House. He did not have a national following. I mean, he just didn't. He wasn't going to catch fire. So the only way that Nixon would get into trouble would be some sort of self-inflicted wound, which he managed to avoid, right, in the campaign. It would only be, it would only then be the discovery process, right, where these plumbers were put on trial, and right when they were the adjudication process, and one of them wanted to meet with the judge, CIA agent, this kind of thing. It's just like, then it just sort of exploded. But this is just astounding. It didn't make sense then. It doesn't make sense now.
No, it was irrational.
Irrational.
Really, yeah.
100%. That's it.
But anyway, at the arraignment, this is the strange thing too. It turns out one of these guys was an ex-CIA operative and all that stuff. So that's the beginning. And of course, it doesn't take long before Bernstein and Woodward.
Yeah, Woodward University, you got it.
um, got onto it, and just that became their story. Right?
It did, and they certainly changed American history. We would learn so much about Nixon, including the fact that he was taping everything in the White House, taping everything. Oh God, that's under yeah.
Barbara Walters asked him, "Do you regret not burning the tapes?" This was after, of course,
Yes, right.
years after
So,
the presidency, and he said yes. Okay.
well, how could you not on some level?
Well,
I
you
mean,
would, but it's so strange the times that he chose to be truthful. But yeah, okay.
it's you're right. You're right about that. The times that I mean, he was such a disingenuous guy most of the time, but then suddenly the truth would just come springing forth. It is. I mean, we'll talk about this in future episodes. You just have to wonder what Nixon thought would happen. I mean, he held these. He knew he had the tapes, and there were, thousands of hours. Did he really think that he would just be able to just hold on to them forever? That nobody would ever, get access to them? I just that to me is just astounding. I mean, who does that?
But it very nearly worked out that way.
Well, it did. It very nearly did. You're absolutely right about that.
And that's the strange part about it. I mean, it was just a kind of an almost an aside where it was mentioned that he was taping everything, and most people on the committee that were looking into it, nobody knew that until just some of the witnesses.
It was Alexander Butterfield, almost in a kind of
go.
offhanded remark,
Yes.
mentioned this, and it was like tapes.
Tapes?
There are tapes. And then suddenly everything changed, and it didn't just change in terms of the committee that was investigating, but also changed in terms of the Republican Party. And once it became, I mean, there was just really no going back. It's just this burglary. The implications of this are just so far-reaching that it's just burglary, whatever you want to call it. This
starts
adventure
as a strange little odd news blip.
Yes.
On June 17th.
Yeah, 3 or 4 paragraphs.
We'll have an opportunity to say more about this as we go along, but this is the start of an incredible odyssey.
This is where it starts.
Also in June, also outside of music news for just a second, Atari Incorporated is founded on June 27th. And that's going to end up having some major consequences for popular culture.
That's for sure. I mean, Atari remains a player. And they'll really strike gold here in a few months in 72.
Yeah. June 1st, the first eponymous album by the Eagles is released.
Yeah, that's an interesting foundation story, right? Where you had Glenn Frey and Don Henley playing back up to Linda Ronstadt. Linda Ronstadt's right, her manager, John Boylan, very affirming and supportive of their idea of starting out on their own. In fact, to the point where he brings in the other 2 members, Randy Meisner and Bernie Ledden. And Bernie Ledden. So you talk about this group. Bernie Ledden is the only person that actually had any kind of name recognition at this point. He had just finished a 10-year duty in the Flying Burrito Brothers. Yeah. But yeah, this is where it starts. The Eagles.
Okay, on the 9th, there it is, the 33rd studio album by James Browne, released on Polydor Records. It contained 5 of his early 70s hits and reached number 10 on the Billboard R&B charts and number 60 on the Billboard 200. James Browne still it's a powerhouse, right?
Still a powerhouse, an exacting taskmaster. It wasn't a lot of fun to be in his band, but his methods, it produced results. just an explosive live performer. You talk about all these albums he's making, but I mean, I don't know. I mean, he's just jaw dropping in terms of his particularly in the 60s and early 70s, just jaw dropping in terms of his stage presence. It's amazing.
Oh yeah, and you know, the Jackson Five. They talk about how Michael Jackson he learned stagemanship watching
Absolutely.
Browne.
There's just it's clear that he did. I mean, you know, imitation, the sincerest form of flattery. I mean, you put those
just see his moves and all that.
Yeah.
And even his vocal stylings to a certain extent.
I think that's right.
So on the 10th, Elvis Presley does first of four concerts at Madison Square Garden in New York City. And he sold out all those shows in one day. 4 Madison Square Garden concerts sold out in one day. And this would be the concert that was recorded for Elvis Presley live at Madison Square Garden.
So to achieve an SRO in the 70s meant that you actually had to show up, right, and get tickets. And so you're talking about thousands of people, you know, putting themselves out and, you know, standing in line, this kind of thing.
This is a good point. Yes, very good point.
And you wouldn't think that New York City would necessarily be a kind of Elvis city, you know, Elvis. But yeah, every place in the United States was Elvis. I mean, it was, you know, he owned the country. He's not quite yet the parody, the complete parody that he will become in a few years. He can still deliver quite a show. The king.
So
the king.
On the 14th at Madison Square Garden, Simon and Garfunkel reunite briefly to support Democratic presidential candidate George McGovern.
Oh, McGovern. Yes.
Other performers include Peter, Paul, and Mary and Dionne Warwick. Also on the 14th, coincidentally, I'm sure, Simon and Garfunkel's Greatest Hits is released.
That's an album that everyone owned. Man. Maybe everyone still owns it. It's a must-have, right?
Yeah, it's just fantastic. So, yeah, one of the really great anthology albums.
Oh, no question, right?
On the 16th, Roxy Music comes out with their self-titled debut,
which took and
records.
Yeah, and so real quickly, Roxy Music, their look, their stage presence was so kind of jaw dropping. Nobody had ever seen anything like Roxy Music, and nobody really heard anything like Roxy Music. And again, a particular
brand of glam.
Yeah, particular brand of glam. This version of Roxy Music again has Brian Eno on kind of space keyboards, and he won't stay with the group very long. But their debut was, particularly in Europe, really caught a lot of attention.
Well, and God knows they went on to make some fantastic records.
Sure.
Also on that day, the rise and fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars.
This is it. This is the album. Yeah.
David Bowie's 5th studio album released by RCA Records.
Yeah.
So 16th, also a good day for glam rock anyway.
Well, that's for sure.
On the 22nd, A Song for You, the 4th studio album by the Carpenters, released.
Those crazy kids from down in California.
Yeah, and like half of this album appears on their greatest hits later on.
That's for
sure. Enough, one of the songs that did not become a single, did not become a hit, was the title song, A Song for You, written by Leon Russell.
Who's also, right, if it's the early 70s, Leon Russell is, you know, but that is a little odd in a way that didn't do more for the.
But that doesn't matter, because 4 days later, Carney comes out, Leon Russell's 3rd solo studio album, and the only one, at least until then, that actually had singles that charted.
That's right
for him. So
that's right.
So yeah. he was doing okay. June 72 was good to Leon Russell.
Yes, it was.
On the 30th, School's Out appears by Alice Cooper.
Oh.
His their 5th studio album.
The title track is it's so fantastic. It's also so funny. There always was with Alice Cooper a kind of wink and a nod.
Oh yes.
They were sort of in. They were in on the joke. They wanted you to kind of be in on the joke as well. I think this is also. I think Bob Ezrin has linked with the group at this point, and so Ezrin is producing these records and really schooling them on what it means to be a rock star. And this really this is the kind of peak time for the original Cooper band, the early 70s.
Oh yeah, and Alice Cooper was very clear about his contributions. That without him,
yes,
we wouldn't have gone anywhere.
That's right.
Also in June, ABBA releases their first single, "People Need Love," and the founding father Roy Wood leaves Electric Light Orchestra just as the band scores its first hit single.
This is, real quickly, that Roy Wood was really was the creative engine in the latter years of the Move and the earliest incarnation of ELO, but got itchy feet very quickly and left just really before things started to happen for ELO. One wonders, because Wood's a very eccentric individual and a very eccentric performer. One wonders what ELO would have looked like with the full Roy Wood participation. But he got out very, very early.
Maybe he had a similar aversion or allergy to success, like Neil Young. Maybe it has.
Well, one wonders. One wonders, because it certainly, and it looks that way in retrospect.
Excuse the interruption, but our 1972 year-end review, although conceived and recorded in one setting, got longer and bulkier than we had anticipated. So we decided to split it up. You've just watched the first half, the months January through June, 1972, and our next video will continue with the months July through December, finishing up the year. So if you enjoyed this video, which we hope you did, you can continue just watching right up here for the second half. You'll definitely want to check out the playlist, as always, which you can find right here. And if you haven't done it yet, subscribe to the channel. We really appreciate it.